The things I'm going to discuss at the beginning, I noticed that they've already been discussed this morning. So what I'd like to do is to quickly go through the first few slides. The pharmaceutical industry is in a crisis. And it's a crisis that, frankly, was totally predictable. And I'll try to show you that. And it wasn't dealt with appropriately. I do have a slide of the electronic industry, and it goes back to the early when tubes were developed, and then the 5 major changes that occurred across the electronic industry up till now. And what happened was that if you list the 5 largest, most successful companies in each of those 5 areas of electronics, you'll note that none of the companies repeat themselves. There's a lesson to be learned in all of this, that simply being number 1 can also be a fateful outcome, or 2 or 3. In other words, we live in a world that is constantly changing, and the question is how best to adapt to that going forward. And I'm sure our next speaker will touch upon that. Where are we in the pharmaceutical industry? None of this is news to anyone here, but we have massive patent expirations across big pharma, and I'll show you some data. The pipeline deficiencies exist across all major companies, and I'll show you that as well, the facts. And critical short-term capital is not accessible to the biotech companies. And R&D costs are escalating with markedly reduced productivity. So what do? Give up? Well, here, let's just show the problem. Several people showed this in different ways. I've included biotech spending here as well as big pharma spending. But basically, what you can see in the upper left is that from 1997 through 2008, what you see is about $19 billion in 97. 11 years later, last year, $65 billion. That's over a 3-fold change in 11 years. And what do you see in terms of productivity of new molecular entities, including small molecules and proteins? You see that with the exception of a peak in 2004, you see a constant decline. This is a CFO's nightmare and a head of R&D's nightmare as well. And what you see is that now it's 23, 24 new compounds per year. Well, if you're spending $65 billion, the argument that a compound actually costs $800 million to bring forward is a way low number. The fact of the matter is, it's closer to $2.5 to $3 billion per approved new drug. I'm not talking about line extensions, I'm talking about new drugs. That is not sustainable when the average drug is going to bring in $750 million a year or thereabouts. How can you invest that much money and still be profitable? If we look at losses due to patent expirations at the bottom, it's $50 billion in the US through 2011 up to 2012, and that's about $100 billion globally. That number will double by 2015. Now we're talking $200 billion of loss. So the question is, and that's, let me just also jump back and show you what you would expect, is the price to earnings ratios of the major companies have gone down consistently as well. The 2009 numbers I doubt will look any better, given where the markets are at. Now, this is a calculation that I did for PFIZER in, I think it was mid-2002. And what I knew that within PFIZER, at that time we had announced, so it's in the public domain, so I can talk about it, that we could deliver 4 products per year. And so we called it 20 in 5. In a 5-year interval, we were going to deliver 20 new products. We did, in fact, achieve 18 in that time period. But what we also knew was based on the patent expirations and based upon what the growth you wanted in sales between 8 to 10%, 8 for the larger companies, 10% for somewhat mid-sized pharma. What you see is that on the left-hand side is a number of companies, and these were just chosen. This was an analysis done by Fred Frank, but it came out with exactly the same number. Somewhat between 8 and 9 products per year was required by Pfizer in 2002, based on, this one was done in 2005 sales, and what you see in 2008 approvals is 1. And you see that all of the companies down the list are facing the same problem. This is assuming a 750 average peak sales, 750 million. So what's the problem? All this money is being spent. One could give a 2-hour talk on what one might think are the major problems. In thinking about what I wanted to do after I retired, other than sailing and a few other things, that was kind of boring. So I decided to go ahead and we began this venture with my partner, Stephen Evans-Freak. And one of the most compelling pieces of data for me, where there are about 2,300, a bit over, compounds in clinical development all over the world. Look at where they are. If you look at the percent of that pipeline, 67% of those compounds in clinical development are in the small biotech companies. They have 2% of the R&D spending compared to big pharma. They have 8% of the cash and 3% of the market capitalization. If there ever was a capital disconnect, this is it. And so, in looking at that, looking at the lack of productivity in pharma and what pharma needs and what biotech needs, that's how we moved forward with CELTIC Therapeutics. And if you look at the biotech community, basically there's about 325, I think, public biotech companies in the US. I've listed more than 300 here, but look at the market caps. These are very low compared to what they were. There's only about 100 public biotech firms in Europe. Where most of these compounds reside are in the private biotech companies. There's about 1,000 in the US, there's well over 1,000 in Europe, plus other biotech companies around the world besides Europe and the US. This is basically a very fertile ground for great ideas with little capital